Welcome everybody to my podcast, Big Little Small Talk. I'm Megan O'Hara-Sullivan and I love to talk, but I also love to listen. If you're new here, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome along everybody. We're here today on FM 102.7 Community Radio and that segment called Big Little Small Talk, where I get to go out into the community and talk to someone that I find very interesting. And today I'm down at Withcott. I'm talking to a person who has become a friend. I've met her in a work experience, but she has since become a friend, and her name's Claire Torkington, and she is the centre manager for Grand Central. Now that is a pretty impressive job, Claire. Welcome along.
It probably sounds a bit more impressive than it is in reality.
No, no.
Basically the coordinator of a small community.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting way to put it. I want to talk about your work a little bit later on and how you got to be in such a impressive job. And I really wanted to talk to you today because, Claire, to me, you are a champion of young girls and women and a feminist. And, you know, I'm a proud feminist myself, and I've seen some of the things that you do in the community. And I think your job, as much as you try to play it down, is a really important role in our community. So I notice that you have an accent. So your accent, where do we get the accent?
So I'm a bit of a global roamer. I was born in the north of England, about 30 miles north of Manchester, actually. But when I was only 2 years old, we moved first to Tanzania and then to Kenya. So I actually grew up in East Africa. And I think that probably, so lucky to have had that experience, so lucky. But I think that's probably where my commitment to equality of all strands actually began.
Right. And why did you go to Tanzania and Africa? What was...
My father's job. The family moved there. My father worked for the British government for a couple of African governments. He was one of the first graduates in computing science from Manchester University. So he actually set up the Kenyan government computer department.
Wow. And what was that like? You're probably a bit too young, but what does your mother talk about when your father came home and said, how do you feel about moving to Tanzania, sweetie?
Well, my mother is also one of the main reasons for my commitment to, I guess, social well-being of people, I guess. Mum is a completely amazing woman who literally moved to Africa with 4 children under the age of 4. Mum was a teacher. She taught in Paris for a little while before she met Dad, and just packed up and headed for Africa.
Right. And where did you fit into the family of 4?
So I have an older brother who is 11 months to the day older than myself and my identical twin. So if people who know me ever see me and I don't say hello, it genuinely is the evil twin that they're encountering.
So you are the evil twin, or your twin's the evil twin?
Oh, well, it depends on which twin you ask, of
yes,
course.
Of course, yeah.
And then we have a younger sister.
So you're in the middle, the twins are in the middle.
Yes.
And what was that like growing up in Africa? Tell me about that.
Incredible. I mean, it was at times, as we got a bit older, very sobering because it taught you, and I, again, coming back to Mum, very lucky that Mum is a good northern lass, working class, north of England, first of her family to go to university, and a strong sense of social justice, who was actually considered at moments in Kenya quite odd because of her commitment to fairness in terms of the people who worked for us, because everyone over there has servants. And the first thing Mum did whenever we moved house was fully renovate the servants' quarters, because they were never of a standard that she felt the people who were working for us should live in.
How interesting. So what sort of time frame did you stay in Africa?
Basically most of my childhood. I think I was about 15 when we left and went very briefly back to England before we emigrated to Australia.
And you came out 16. To Australia as a family, all
yes,
of you together?
Okay.
Did. And where did you come to?
Brisbane.
And you went to school in Brisbane?
I did. I went to Mount St Michael's in Brisbane, yeah.
And then when you left school, you went to university, or did you go and work, or what happened from there?
Not immediately. Having been to sort of 11 different schools in 5 different countries, our education was slightly disrupted, and it meant that in certain classes we'd done, so for example, when I first went into grade 10 here, we'd studied French and Latin and things for 11 years, and they were in their first year. Now, my response to boredom has always been mischief, so...
Oh, that might be why we became friends, do you think?
Probably wasn't much loved at Mount St Michael's. So I got a summer job in an advertising agency, and I loved it. It was very Mad Men back in those days. But at the end of it, convinced them to keep me on. So to my father's and probably my mother's absolute horror, didn't go straight to university.
So what were you doing at the advertising agency? Anything, was it?
The lowest of the low,
right.
Sweeping the floor,
right.
literally. Cutting out, this is hilarious because of course it doesn't happen anymore, but cutting out what were called bromides that were the little pictures that went onto the base art to make ads in those days.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you about your advertising career because I note that at some stage in your life you worked at Mojo, and I want to talk about that a little bit later on. But the other children in your family, what have they gone on to do now?
So my brother did law at uni, law and business. He's very, very smart. He borders on a photographic memory. So he then, though, went into, you never play Trivial Pursuit with Nicholas. He then went into the public service and has basically been in Canberra or posted overseas ever since. He works overseas and then comes home for a couple of years and goes off again. So he's had some interesting postings. Kate, my twin, was a bit like me and originally went to be a hairdresser, then went to London and worked running a chain of pubs and used to redevelop pubs. Then when she came back, she retrained and did a degree in industrial relations, I think it was, and now she's a change manager doing a lot of contract work, and my younger sister is an accountant.
Okay. And how did you all sort of integrate back into, or, well, you wasn't back into a life in Australia because you hadn't actually been here before. And what about your mum and dad? How did they settle away from their family?
Look, they settled. Unfortunately, they didn't remain married in the long run, but my father has a lovely new wife, and mum is very, very happy. She didn't teach when she came here. She went into social work and ended up being the head of respite services for a major service provider. So we all have had an amazing life, really, in Oz, and are, I think, very grateful for the opportunities that I don't think we necessarily would have brought ourselves to had we stayed in the UK. I was not happy when we moved to the UK and wasn't focusing on my education and things like that. So I think it was a bit of a restart for us, and I think it really is still a place that offers people who emigrate here amazing opportunities.
What an astute observation, I would say. And what about your father then? Did he keep working at a government level, or what did he do then?
No, he then, when he came over here, I think it was ICI or ICL that he came over to work for, so he worked for them for quite a long time.
What sort of company is ICI?
It was computing.
Uh-huh.
He then went into consulting and worked in various consulting firms for quite a few years, but then his final job, which was sort of his retirement job, was he was the general manager of GPS Rugby Club for quite some years.
In Brisbane, at Toowong?
Yes.
Is that right?
Ashgrove.
Ashgrove, right.
He's always been a rugby player, so that was... He now got paid to drink beer at the rugby club instead of doing it for free.
Bonus, winning. That's right. That sounds good. And your twin, are you identical?
We are very identical, yes.
Oh, well, that's right. You said about the evil twin. That's
Yes.
right. Yeah. And do you have much contact with her?
Oh, yeah. Multiple times a week we would ring each other, and we would... She and my mum come up here quite regularly to Toowoomba. I go down to see them. Mm-hmm. It would be unusual if more than 2 weeks passed that we're not sort of catching up.
There's definitely something there, isn't there? You believe in the magic of twins, I suppose?
There is definitely something in it. It was very interesting. When I lived in London, and she did too, one of the biggest twin studies in the world is out of St Thomas's Hospital that was just round the corner from where we live near London Bridge, and they'd sort of asked us to participate a few times, but we weren't very keen. It felt a bit intrusive, but we did have one very interesting conversation with one of the people there who was involved in the study, because when we said, what's your view of the whole twin thing? And his reply was interesting, because he said, well, basically you're genetically the same person who's been raised exactly the same way. So it would in fact be weird if you didn't have incredibly similar thoughts, but I don't think anyone can explain. We call it the message, and it's not small things, but if something very major happens to Kate or to me, for some reason the other one will get some sort of sixth sense and will ring.
Right.
It's happened a few times over the years, enough for it to be not able to be a coincidence. And even more strangely, I remember once when I was still in Australia and Kate was working in London, I woke up at 2:00 in the morning with one of the strongest kind of iterations of this message I'd ever had. And I immediately rang her, and my partner at the time was, "What are you doing? It's 2 a.m. I was like, no, it's not 2 a.m. in London. Just got the message, need to ring Kate. I rang her, I said, "Are you okay? I just got a really strong..." And she started to laugh and she said, "That is really weird. I am okay, but at this exact moment yesterday, I had a bad car crash. I wasn't hurt, but the car is totaled, and it was almost as though it had taken the exact same amount of time that it would have been taken for me to be there, for me to get the message." Very strange.
I've got cold chills. I don't know how the listeners are feeling. My mother-in-law is an identical twin. I don't know that I have ever heard any stories like that, but she used to tell the story that they grew up in Longreach, and they both worked at Silly Solly's or whatever the equivalent was, and one would be downstairs and a customer would come in and they'd say, "Oh no, you have to go upstairs to the department upstairs," and then her identical twin was up the top, and yes, freaking people out like that. But you're probably a little bit lucky, because that was in the days where the twins, my mother-in-law, were named after the doctor that gave birth, or the nurses named them after the nurses who were there, and so they were called Jill and Joan, and then Joan married a twin called Jack, whose twin is Joan. So, yeah. Is Jill, sorry, Jack and Jill, that's right. So I think some of those crazy days are gone. Now, you mentioned about being in London, and I see when you were in London that you were working for the Department of Health. Is that right? You're the Chief of Staff in Improvement Directorate at the Department of Health. Tell me about that job.
So how that came about, when I first went over, Kate was in London, and my dad's mum, our two great aunts had both just passed away, and they were amazing women who had all lived in this house together since 1937. And she had sort of said she might be interested in moving to Australia. My mum's mum, my other gran, moved out here when she was 77 and spent the rest of her life with us in Australia. So the idea was that Kate and I would go and see Gran and help her sell the house. And anyway, when we got there, it sort of didn't quite work out that way. I think she just wasn't... It was too hard. She wasn't quite as well as we thought she was. And so we sort of had the rather horrible choice of waiting for the inevitable, which at that stage, she wasn't very well. It didn't look very far away, but 9 years later, she was still going. She was an amazing woman. And so that was what I was doing in London initially. And then when it became obvious that we were going to be in London for considerably longer than we had anticipated, I just started doing some contract work, because at that stage before leaving Oz, I'd been working for Lend-Lease and in their global organisational development department, doing sort of organisational development, acquisitions, divestments of various companies and bits of the companies. So I just started to do some consulting work and ended up working in the NHS they just formed the primary care trusts over there, and I was working with an amazing woman called Fiona Adshead, who was the Director of Public Health in Camden. Anyway, sort of a few months went past, and then Fiona was made the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for England and asked me to go and work as her Head of Development / Chief of Staff. So there I was then, the Aussie hanging out in Whitehall, which was very interesting.
Right. And at that stage, was that sort of you felt sort of your best job yet, like that this was really a career improvement, and you'd really kind of stepped up in the world?
To be honest, it was absolutely accidental. It wasn't, but I did then find it fascinating, and I did like the fact that you were working on public health policy that really made a difference to people's lives. Whitehall was a very interesting place to work, particularly for a fairly down-to-earth, by now consider yourself an Australian sort of a person.
Now, excuse my ignorance, but what is Whitehall?
So Whitehall is like the public service street. So each of the departments in sort of the London Parliament system have a premises down Whitehall. So you've sort of got, the foreign affairs bit and the health bit, and all of the departments in the government sit on various premises in Whitehall. And it is quite funny there because it does have, or at least it did then, let's remember this is quite a few years ago, things may have changed. I used to think Yes Minister was a comedy. It's in fact a documentary.
Funny that. I won't make a comment on that, but I'll just remind the listeners that they're on 102.7 FM and we're in our segment called Big Little Small Talk, and we're talking to Claire Torkington, who is the centre manager at Grand Central Shopping Centre here in Toowoomba, and we're just going through her career and how she's sort of come to be in this austere position as the centre manager. So we're working at Whitehall. I can imagine there would have been a fair few stories to come out of that. And then what happened? You thought, I'm going to go back to Australia, or Granny didn't last then?
Yes, so I did only spend about maybe 18 months in Whitehall, because then I got offered an amazing job by the Chief Executive of Camden Primary Care Trust as their Director of Corporate Development and Communication. So I went and did 4 years then at Camden. Very interesting, various portfolios, including emergency management. And whilst I was in that role, the bombs went off in London. So that was very challenging. So then eventually Gran passed away, and we were always coming back as soon as that happened. So headed back here. And then fortunately I went down to Sydney to see a few friends, and I bumped into an old colleague from Lend-Lease who asked me what I was doing. Was, great that you're back. And when I said, I'm just taking a couple of months off, I don't know what I'm going to do next, I then got a phone call the next week saying, we're actually doing a development up in Mackay where we're sort of doubling the size of the shopping centre up there. Would you be interested in going and doing that? And I thought, I haven't really been up north, but I'll go and have a look. So I then went from central London to downtown Mackay, which was something of a culture shock.
Culture and temperature shock, I can
Yes.
imagine. I was only in Mackay last week, the week before, and it was steamy.
It's like living in soup for 6 months of the year. It's a beautiful place, but it is hot and sticky.
Yes. So what sort of years is that now? Where are we up to?
Now we would be up to, I returned from London in 2009.
Okay. Well, I've jumped over the part that I wanted to talk about. We mentioned earlier about you working for Mojo, which of course was that famous advertising agency, and you were working there in the early 80s, is that correct?
It would have been the late 80s.
Okay. So tell me about that world of advertising, because, they're so famous for those big campaigns. You ought to be congratulated, the Meadow Lee one, the Come On Aussie Come On, the World Series cricket, the Paul Hogan throw another shrimp on the barbie. What was that like being in that world?
Amazing as a young person. Look, it was challenging, it was tough. You worked in those days phenomenally long hours. I remember when we did the pitch for, I think it was Marina Mirage, we basically didn't leave the agency for 72 hours. But it was incredibly exciting, amazing people, and they very much catered to things that people think are new things via Google and things like that were very much going on in the agencies in those days, mostly to keep us there for as long as possible. But we had an agency chef, we had an amazingly stocked kitchen, bar opened at 3 every day. There was all of this stuff that when you were young and working in that environment, it was amazingly exciting, as well as the chance to work on amazing campaigns.
Yes, I can imagine. It was when all that money's sloshing around, Christopher Skase and
Very
Marina
lavish
Mirage.
lunches, and yes, all of that was going on.
What sort of looking back on it and distilling it, if you said what I learnt from working at Mojo, what would it have been?
I learned 2 things: how to be very fast on my feet and very adaptable. And I also learned how to drink a lot in front of a client without it showing.
Right.
No longer useful these days.
You're right, yeah, not a skill you can put on your resume. Funnily enough, I did not see that on LinkedIn. Claire Torkington can know how to drink a lot without... So what's the secret? You don't really drink, or you sort of
Partly,
look as
yes.
though you're...
You drink a lot of water.
Okay, right. Oh, well, there you are, kids. It's coming as good advice. So I'm jumping around a little bit at the moment with your career, but I did see something on your resume that said you were very good at B2B and B2C marketing. Now, what does that mean?
Business to business versus business to consumer. Mm-hmm. So they're the two
things you need to be good at.
The 2 different kind of streams of...
Okay, so explain that to me. What does that mean?
So some people in marketing some of the roles would focus on business to business communication. So you're speaking to another business about, often something that would not be commonly consumed by a daily consumer, whereas B2C is you to the public. So a more broadcast kind of marketing, that where you're talking to the general public as opposed to another business.
Okay. That sounds like, you talk about Yes Minister, but I guess it's just in that world of marketing, is it? It's something,
absolutely.
A technique, yeah.
I think every industry, every profession, every role has its own jargon.
Yes,
and often when
like,
you switch careers, you've got to learn almost a whole new language.
Exactly. It's all the sort of, is it an outward-facing document? Is it an inward-facing document? All of that. Okay, so again, we're jumping around. You're in Mackay. I'm trying to work towards how we got to be the centre manager here at QIC at Grand Central in Toowoomba. So how did we sort of come to this role?
So when I first went to Mackay, I was still sort of doing marketing, but it was more a retail development marketing role. And then whilst I was there, the centre manager actually left. And it's sometimes, because it's quite a specialised sort of a role in asset management, it's sometimes quite difficult to get people quickly to regional areas. So Lendlease just asked me, would I be the acting centre manager until they found a new one? And it just so happened that it took them sort of 7 months to find a new one. So that was when I first started to do the centre manager role as opposed to sort of other things in the industry. But I didn't necessarily want to stay in a centre manager role because my big love was development.
That's your dogs in the
That's
background.
my dog crying because he wants a treat.
We'll carry on.
Yes.
Yep.
Be quiet. So I then, when they got a new centre manager, I then got offered the opportunity to work on the Brisbane Showgrounds redevelopment with Lendlease.
Now, Claire, we've quietened the dogs by giving them a stinky stick, also called a crocodile stick. Is that right?
Yes, it's just
quickly. We take a quick diversion, as I sometimes like to do. Tell me about your two dogs here. You've got one older dog who was doing the whinging, and he's got something that needs stinky sticks.
Well, they're both rescues and they're both special needs. He's actually got a condition called eosinophilic enteritis, which means he's very limited in the things he can eat, and he can only basically eat single ingredient treats or food which manages his condition.
Dietary requirements for dogs.
That's
Who
right.
knew? I didn't know. I didn't realise there was such a thing. So now you're in the middle of telling me you were acting as the centre manager up in Mackay, and you didn't really, because your thing was really development
and marketing. So I got the opportunity to work on the Brisbane Showgrounds redevelopment with Lendlease, which was just fantastic, an amazing master plan. Most of the rural associations now have basically lost the farm, so to speak. So there's very few of the agricultural shows that are still in their original homes, but the RNA was very forward thinking in that they came up with an agreement with Lendlease whereby some of the land has been used, but the ECA still goes on where it's always gone on. And there's amazing buildings there now, like the cow park, which is actually a car park for most of the year, but converts to be the cattle pavilion for the ECA. So fabulous project to work on, worked on that for a little while, and then was recruited to go up and do another redevelopment on the Sunshine Coast. Same thing actually happened to me there. As the development came to an end, the centre manager retired. And so they said to me, will you be the centre manager? I think by then I was living in house number 39 that I'd lived in my life. So I sort of started to think, actually, I wouldn't mind, because if I was the centre manager for places, I could stay a bit longer. And I was just getting to the stage where moving house was becoming a little bit tiring or boring. So, yeah.
So that's what you did. Okay, so tell me about the day in the life of a centre manager. I mean, your skills are obviously broad and wide, and tell me how it works. What does a day in the life of a centre manager, what would you do most days?
So the thing I love about it is you never know what's coming at you, and you can have a day planned out. So most days I would arrive, I tend to get there fairly early, because 7:30ish, because then I get sort of an hour before the phone starts ringing and retailers are wanting to talk to you, get some paperwork done. Then I'll do a centre walk, inspect the centre, see if there's anything maintenance-wise. My maintenance team also do that. Just have a look at what's going on, chat to a couple of retailers, then come back. There's often meetings with other teams or with head office. But the beauty of it is that you can do so many different things in a day. I mean, I remember once making a presentation to a group of high school students who were thinking of potentially having a career in asset management, and explaining to them about one particular day that I had when I worked at Penrith Plaza, where it started off at a very high level. We had some investors from, I think, a Dutch pension fund or something flying in, potentially looking at putting a large sum of money into some of the property trusts that own the centres. So I was very, smartly dressed in the suit doing the presentation. And then as they sort of headed off to be choppered out from the Penrith Panthers, we got a call over the radio that was a code blue that someone had had a heart attack. So you rush to the scene, and you literally end up on your hands and knees doing CPR if that's what's needed. Often security will do it, but depending on what's going on. So you were doing that. Then I had to rush back for another meeting. I was in the meeting and it was smaller staff in those days because it was a smaller centre than Grand Central, when, someone came in and said, "Oh, look, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but the kids' show that was supposed to start 5 minutes ago, the rabbit hasn't shown up, the guy in the rabbit suit." So 5 minutes later...
Don't tell me you're in
the rabbit suit. I'm in the rabbit suit. You aren't. No. Dancing. Somehow a job in management promised more.
That's right.
But this still happens today. If we're there sort of late in the evening and, every now and then, the other week, we got a lot of rain. I'm on a broom in the dock. So there's trying to get the water away. You do whatever's in front of you on the day.
Right, incredible. So tell me too, how does it work in shopping centres? Who decides who's coming in and who's going out, and how does that all work?
There's a lot of science behind all that. So we look at a lot of research. We do consumer research. Then the leasing team will negotiate with various retailers. We have a list of most requested retailers. They'll do a deal with them, bring them into the centre. It's quite a process.
Uh-huh. And did you come on board with the expansion of Grand Central? Is that when you came to be the centre manager here in Toowoomba with the QIC development there?
I came just after the expansion.
Okay, right. And is there a sort of a philosophy, or what are you sort of aiming to, like with a shopping centre? Is it sort of to create I imagine, obviously, it's where people want to be and where they want to recreate as well as kind of shop and lots of other things. Like, what's the sort of the theory around shopping centres?
These days, more and more, they are becoming like the old town squares used to be. And it is the aim to create a place where people can come. It's not just about shopping at all anymore. You'll see more and more now it becoming almost there are educational facilities moving into a lot of shopping centres. There's medical facilities moving into a lot of shopping centres. In places where you've got denser residential living, there's apartments going in with shopping centres. There's certainly a lot more food and leisure and entertainment going in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know my sister was living in Abu Dhabi and I would go over and see her, and all the restaurants were in the shopping centre. I always thought that it was probably more to do with the air conditioning rather than anything else, but I don't know. I guess it's sort of more you have people in there than they're recreating in there as well, aren't they? Well, it's an incredible, I can't imagine how diverse your job is. But I noticed too on your resume, Claire, that you say that you specialise in the soft skills. What are the soft skills?
To me, it's more about the secret to being a very good centre manager is to always hire people better than yourself at the individual components of running a centre. So I have an incredible operations manager who knows far more about operations for centre than I ever will. I have a brilliant finance person in my assistant retail manager. I have a great marketing team. So for me, my job is almost to steer the ship. And, sometimes in a place like that, you might have two different disciplines with slightly different requirements. So you've got marketing who want to put down some shiny floor decals for Christmas, and you've got operations saying, now hold on a minute, I just did a strip and seal on that floor and you're going to come and put a big sticker on it. So again, you're just looking at the needs of everybody, dealing with the retailers, any issues they've got. So it's more about being able to have a broad overview of things, know a bit about every discipline, and then be able to lead the team and take your hands off them and let those experts do what they do best.
Is that what you'd say is a soft skill, or is a soft skill sort of the negotiating and being able to read people and know what they need? Or
I mean, everything's a negotiation in the role with wide ranges of people. And I think it's also just about being able to see things from different people's points of view, being able to keep calm when there is any kind of a crisis. It's not necessarily always specific technical knowledge. It's just being good at dealing with people, negotiating, planning.
Sounds incredible to me. I'll just remind the listeners that they're on 102.7 FM, and we're in a segment called Big Little Small Talk, where we're talking to someone in the community who I find very interesting. And my interesting interviewee today is Claire Torkington, who is the centre manager at Grand Central Shopping Centre. Now, Claire, I did say before about one of the things that I really love about you is your championing of women's causes and women's issues. Are you sort of at Grand Central or in your philosophy with your work, are you doing anything specific there, or is that sort of that's just the sort of beliefs that you bring to the role? Or
they are definitely the beliefs that I bring to the role, but I guess my commitment to equality is quite intersectional. I'm very lucky in that QIC, who run Grand Central, are very advanced in terms of organisations, in terms of their commitment to equality and diversity in the workplace. We have a very diverse team. I think, again, it comes back to, I guess, your upbringing, doesn't it? And having had a mother who was always worked, was always, quite independent in her thought, and very strongly encouraged all of us girls, all of us children, to have absolutely the expectation that we could do or be whoever we want. And I've just, I suppose, over the years become quite committed. It's interesting to see the change nowadays in workplaces. Obviously, having been in effectively ad agencies followed by Lend-Lease, was born of a construction company, there were times in previous years where it was challenging to be a woman, and because I was, I suppose, relatively senior, relatively early in my career, you did encounter challenges. Prior to working for Lend-Lease, I worked for LJ Hooker in the franchise services side under one of the actual great mentors of my career, a guy called Graham Cook, who's sadly passed away now, but Graham was just amazing in terms of his support of women, particularly young women in the workplace.
What did he do specifically? What can you remember some of the things that he did? How was he generous, and he was always trying to lift you up, or sort
Absolutely.
of and give you credit for the things that you did?
Absolutely. Yeah. But he was not an easy taskmaster in some ways, but he would speak to you. And I remember when I was really quite young, him asking me to go to Sydney to be the national marketing manager. And I think I was 21 or 22, and by that stage I'd gone to university part-time whilst I was working in the agencies, and I'd moved on to the client side, and I'd started as, I think, the assistant marketing manager for Queensland for LJ's. And I remember sort of looking at him and going, because he'd moved to Sydney and become the national general manager, and sort of being quite daunted at the thought of that. And I remember he just looked at me and he said, "It will be a challenge, but just remember, I would never ask you to do something I didn't think you were capable of."
Oh, what a sage piece of advice so early in your career.
He really was a phenomenal mentor. I was very, very lucky to have him as sort of someone who in the early days guided my career.
Right. And do you often think about that when you're going to do something challenging, that or asking people to do things for you, men or women, that you think, I wouldn't ask you unless I thought that you were capable of it?
I use the phrase, and have used it over the years regularly, because it is so empowering to people.
You said before about speaking to a group of young people about asset management. And do you get asked to go to schools or get asked to come and speak to groups like Rotary and school groups? Do they?
Yes, occasionally I do. I've also done it through various programs over the years for interns and things. Particularly at Mirvac, we had a Indigenous intern program where people would come and you know, it's quite interesting because when you work for an organisation that's got a lot of different sort of streams to it, particularly in terms of asset management. So you've got industrial, you've got office, you've got shopping centres I don't think anyone ever thinks, oh, when I grow up, I'm going to be a shopping centre manager.
No, that's not in the,
it's not
in
an
the
obvious
QTAC book.
career choice.
It is not.
So
No.
it is, you know, great to get some people in or go and speak to young people via a careers thing or something and just talk them through, well, this is what you can do in this industry because there's so many things you can do.
Yes, well, that's the trouble, I think. And I remember my kids flicking through the QTAC book and I was thinking, that's what I did 30 years ago. There has to be a better way than flicking through the QTAC book on the night before you have to put your QTAC form in to think, yeah. So I did come to Grand Central at one stage when there was being solar panels fitted to Grand Central. Can you talk to me about that? And whose decision? Does a decision like that get made about having solar panels?
So again, that's QIC, although we have the solar panels plus a lot more. QIC are, like most organisations these days, very committed to sustainability, and you know, a shopping centre obviously does have in a community quite a large footprint in terms of waste, so, and consumption of power and things like that. So it's been rolled out across most QIC centres now, where we're generating our own power for a lot of things, and green power. You might have seen some water tanks going in around the centre as well. They're going to be used for the chiller, for the air conditioners, and also to flush toilets in the centre, so reducing our usage of water through the main system. We're also now, we're quite proud actually that we're up to about, I think last month's statistics, we're just touching on 60% of all waste from Grand Central being recycled.
Okay.
So we've added in a lot of different waste streams, including one quite recently that's really interesting. It's an organics waste stream where we go around our cleaning team and actually collect all of the food scraps, all of the organic waste from any food tenancies. It goes into a unit called a pulp master, which is then pumped out, goes off to a local facility to become organic fertiliser, which we then use on the beds of the shopping centre. So it's sort of a circular economy.
Yeah, and you're getting, that's a decision that is made sort of obviously at a QIC level, but I guess it's the push. Do you get much of a push from your customers to sort of demonstrate how much sustainability?
Yeah, some of it is a push from QIC, but quite a bit of it, like the Pulp Master, is a ground up from the centre, from the operations manager. We do get customers who are interested in sort of taking it further, and I mean our aim is obviously to get really high, 80%, 90%. So you will see over coming months various projects where we will be putting in better bins for sorting, and we've been focusing a lot on the retailer side of it, but we're just about to start really kicking off with the customer side in the next few months.
Oh, that's so interesting. Now, in your spare time, Claire, is there anything like firefighting or something like that which might take your interest?
I was for quite a long time a volunteer with the Rural Fire Brigade, particularly on the Sunshine Coast. Just last year I actually had to have some surgery on my hand, which whilst the result is very good in terms of movement, I don't have the strength that I used to have in my left hand. So I actually haven't been active in the brigade for a couple of months because of that. But I am hoping that in the next sort of few months, after a bit more physio, I'll be able to go back to it.
Right. You haven't got RSI or carpal tunnel or anything like that?
No, I had an accident in another volunteering capacity and snapped the ligaments, the tendons, everything. So I had to have it sort of surgically repaired. So.
Oh my goodness. So also wildlife. You got a particular love for wildlife at all, and volunteering in a wildlife capacity?
I was very much volunteering in a wildlife capacity.
The things you can find out when you stalk someone on the internet.
Well,
Claire.
The reason I was doing that was because, as you can see, the two dogs are both rescues, and I had started to volunteer fostering dogs for a couple of rescues, and as it turned out, I was completely rubbish at that, because when the dogs had issues and things weren't looking great for them, I just kept them, which is called a foster fail.
Right, mistake number one. Don't fall in love with the dog.
That's right. When you've foster failed a couple, you've not got the capacity to have any more. So I then moved on to wildlife, because with wildlife, you can't keep them. So there was no possibility of ending up with a house full of wild animals.
Yeah.
So I did that for quite a long time, and I used to also be an operator do a shift a month on the Wilvos hotline. They run a 24-hour hotline on the sunny coast where if anyone finds injured wildlife, they can ring, and someone will, like me, will get up out of bed at 2 a.m. and go and pick the wildlife up. And
Right. Claire, your amount of interests and skills are wonderful and just encouraging, and I think that was probably why we got on so well when I first met you. You can tell me a story and I can sit here and listen. So what else kind of keeps you interested? You're not like some champion bagpipe player and a champion dancer or something like that, are you?
Oh, definitely not. I have the musical ability of a rock, including singing. But gardening of very recent times has become a little bit of an interest. I bought a little cottage when I moved up to Toowoomba, and it was an acre of dust and prickles basically when I arrived, and I think I'm up to about 150 native species plants planted, with a view to it being ultimately, I guess, a bird and bee and wildlife attracting garden. So I've joined Native Plants Queensland, and I'm busy studying up on native plants. And
Right.
yeah.
You're a real joiner, aren't you? A real participator. Do you think that was because of the moving around? You thought, look, I'm not going to sit here and not know anyone. I'm going to get involved in the community. Is that sort of...
I think so, although my family would say it's because I've got short attention span.
Okay, yes.
I'm just interested in lots and lots of things. And I think that also comes from all of our family are avid readers. Because growing up in Kenya, we basically didn't have TV until I was probably about 14. There was a very small amount of TV that was available, that was Voice of Kenya. But I think it had maybe one English language kids program on per day. So we just didn't ever develop the habit of watching TV. Yeah, there we spent our time outdoors, horse riding, and, it was an amazing place to live. So I think it's because you had such a broad range of interests through having read so much that...
Where did you get the books from in Kenya and Tanzania?
We would get them sent out. Mum's family would send stuff out, and there were bookstores and things that you could buy in Nairobi and places like that.
I might be showing my ignorance. It might be a bit like all those people who think that in Australia there's kangaroos jumping down the main street. So I might be sort of...
Oh, Nairobi is a fairly big city. It was a much smaller city back then, and there were things... more so when we lived in Dar es Salaam. I remember everyone being very excited whenever one of the American ships used to come into Dar es Salaam, because the personnel would always bring butter and apples, because they knew that all of the expats would be going...
Right.
Do you have butter and apples?
Yes. And were they red apples or green apples?
Red apples.
Right.
Butter.
And now you taste a gala apple. Does it take you back to that time?
It reminds me, yes.
Yeah, the smell of them. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? I'll just remind listeners that we're on Big Little Small Talk, and we're talking to Claire Torkington, who is the Centre Manager of Grand Central here in Toowoomba. Now, Claire, I know you've taken a lot of risks in your life, but can I ask you, what do you think has been the biggest risk you've ever taken?
Ooh, probably when, and again, one of those things just from reading about things, and at a certain point in my career, year 2000, I decided that I was just going to quit my very, very good job at Lend-Lease and go and live in Alaska for a year. And off I went.
That's out of left field.
Yeah.
Tell me some more about that, please.
Oh, it was great. I loved it. And I hope one day in the not too distant future to go back. I would love to go and travel some of the same routes I travelled then. Just amazing. Met amazing people. Went on my own. Just decided I've always wanted to go to Alaska. What was happening was, I think the job I was doing at Lend-Lease was transitioning, and it was moving. It was a very global company at that stage still. It was moving to Atlanta, and I didn't really want to live in Atlanta. So they, kindly agreed that I could just go on my merry way, and off we went.
Describe Alaska to me.
Oh, I mean, there's so many different places in Alaska, but it is, and again, it's a few years ago, but it was sort of like it had that very last frontier feeling about it. And I did amazing things, like I became friends with a Swiss girl when I first arrived there. She was like me, on her own, so we travelled together for a while. And we went up into the Yukon, and we went up into the Arctic Circle, and we just hired this beaten up 4-wheel drive that we were just, we did some crazy things. We went and lived in a old abandoned copper mining town for a few weeks where you had to hike in because the bridges had been washed away. And there was a lot of like small little kind of bush airlines that would take you and drop you out in what they called the backcountry for a few days. And it was hilarious. I remember at one point we were going to go and get dropped. It was near the Colombian ice fields. We were going to go and get dropped out back for a little while. And someone had said to us, they like you to file this backcountry pass. And when we went to file this pass, just so very sensible, so they know where you are. It's a very big empty landscape. And one of the people, the rangers at this place, said to us, you should have bear training before you go. So we had this very earnest gentleman come.
What does it consist of? Run.
Well, come to explain the difference between black bears and brown bears and how you should behave. And so the deal was with the black bears, you had to make yourself big and run at the bear yelling. And if it was a brown bear, you had to curl up in a little ball to protect your organs, basically. And, unless it was a sustained attack. And then you were to fight back because the bear was going to eat you anyway.
What was that last bit? The bear was
going to eat you or kill you anyway.
Right.
And I remember we were sitting there and Reggie, my Swiss friend, said, but just remember, not all brown bears are brown and not all black bears are black.
Known unknowns. Known knowns and unknowns.
And then he said, any questions? And Reggie just said, what point do we decide it's a sustained attack?
Yeah. So do you keep in touch with Reggie?
Yes, yeah. I do actually.
Right.
She now lives in a little village called Samarden, which is the next village but one to St. Moritz in Switzerland.
Right.
So I've had a couple of very fun trips over there. St. Moritz is actually pretty swishy. So I've been to the Polo on the lake a couple of times, which has been very funny given that I've arrived usually on an EasyJet flight for £17 and then caught the train. So
Not quite dressed for
the polo on the lake.
Okay. Well, I would imagine the polo here in Toowoomba mightn't have lived up to the polo in St. Moritz for you. What an incredible story. I was not expecting the Alaska for a year. So, Claire, my next question, and listeners would probably be fairly familiar with these slightly obscure questions, but yours today is, if someone gave you an envelope with your death date inside of it, would you open it?
Ooh, no, definitely not.
Wouldn't open it?
No.
Leave it there?
I don't want to know.
Right. Yeah.
I think you don't know for a reason, right? Because then you may not do something, or you may do something that you're either not supposed to do, or you stop doing something that you should do.
Yes. Yeah. I did ask a lovely Robin Prentice, who was a wonderful woman who I met at the squash courts they were having their 60-year squash reunion. And I said to her, if you could do anything and not get caught, what would it be? So that's a question I'll ask you.
Anything and not get caught?
I'll give you time to think about it while I remember the listeners. She said she'd drive across the border and see her family, which I thought was such a sweet answer. It was such a simple thing to say, and because of COVID, you wouldn't do it, but at that stage, it was just such a lovely, heartfelt thing to have thought. So you got any thoughts?
That's a really difficult one for me, because I'm actually, again, people laugh at me because if someone gives me the wrong change in a shop, I immediately point it out to them. Right. Or if they don't charge me for something, I immediately tell them.
Very ethical, yeah.
But what I might do if I knew I wouldn't get caught, actually, is I would probably fill this land and house with multiple animals that I wasn't supposed to have here, right. Like horses or donkeys or...
Right. So something to give you pleasure.
That's right.
Yeah, that's lovely. Well, we're running out of time, but I've got a couple of more questions. My listeners also would know that my guilty pleasure is that I love the royals, and I spend too much time trawling through Instagram looking at the most ridiculous footage of Princess Diana, on a boat in St. Moritz or whatever, or Princess Anne's wedding dress from 1973. But if I could ask you, who is your favourite royal? And you might say none of them, or you might say someone, and why?
I'm not a massive royal fan. However, I think Princess Margaret would be my favourite. I think she's always been a fairly independent woman, and she always looks like she's got a tremendous sense of humour.
This is Princess Margaret, who's no longer alive. Yes. And do you think you liked her because she was a bit naughty?
Yes. And fun.
And smoked.
Yeah, well, and
not that you
and
smoked.
just didn't care.
Yeah.
I used to smoke,
Yeah.
like many people.
Yeah. It was just her sort of irreverence, do you think?
Her slight rebelliousness at a time when that was absolutely not the done thing in the royal family.
Yeah, I love that answer. It's so you, Claire. It really is. Now, my last question, I like to ask people, what's a song that can't keep you off the dance floor?
I'm not a dancer, I have to say. However, really showing my age now, I would have to say it would have to be an ABBA number. Probably Dancing Queen.
Dancing Queen? Well, that's right. I mean, whose feet can stay still when you hear Dancing Queen?
Yep.
Have you had a chance to have a listen to the new ABBA album?
I have not yet, no.
No, I haven't either.
No.
I haven't seen anything, but apparently it's the not avatars, but the 3D, the pictures of them.
Okay, holograms or
holograms
something.
is what that's word that I'm searching for.
Well, interestingly, there's also a new Duran Duran album out, so I'm quite keen to listen to that.
They must be about, I don't know, 100 those guys now, are they? They'd be on their walking frames. You'd be worried that they're going to break a hip if they get up there. I wonder if they've still got their new wave hair. And you were a Duran Duran fan back in the day,
I was. That is my era, yes.
Yes.
No, I saw them briefly interviewed by Rolling Stone, I think. And whilst a couple of them definitely didn't look quite so pretty as they used to, they all looked in remarkably good shape and had hair, although not quite as much as they used to in the 80s.
Yeah, well, we all have an era, don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing to feel embarrassed about that. Now, with that, an hour's gone by. I'm going to have to say thank you for all of your stories. I think I could probably fill up another hour, so we might have to come back again. And the dogs have gone quiet now, and I can hear some more about your incredible life. So thank you, Claire. Thank you for being my guest today on Big Little Small Talk.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thank you. That's it for this week. Thanks for joining me on Big Little Small Talk. I hope you can make the time to join me next week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favourite podcast app.